This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Finding ways to empower those in need through better access to education has been a hallmark service of the development and aid community for decades. The education sector, like any other, is ripe for disruption, especially as we consider how we deliver curriculum over distance, customize education for individual needs, provide alternatives and outlets for both the gifted and those that have special needs, and much more. Michael Trucano, my guest for the 126th episode of the Terms of Reference podcast, has dedicated the past 18 years of his life to thinking and advising governments how they can enhance education through the use of information and communication technologies. Michael is the World Bank's Senior Education and Technology Policy Specialist and Global Lead for Innovation in Education. He is also the principal voice behind the World Bank's influential and widely read EduTech blog. I spoke with Michael in Washington, D.C. And hey, before we dive into the episode, if you like what you're hearing, take a moment to open up iTunes or Google Play or Stitcher or whatever your podcast app happens to be and click on subscribe. Also consider giving the show a rating. It really does help. And finally, please consider sharing this episode or the podcast on Facebook or Twitter to help others get in on making aid and development better. Now on to the show about ICTs and education with Michael. Hello, Mike. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks a lot for having me. It is a great honor, and I look forward to speaking with you.
We'll see how great of an honor it is when we're done.
Fair enough. Likewise, no doubt.
You are a world traveler, like most of our guests on this show. Where do we find you sitting today?
So today you find me sitting in my office here at the World Bank in downtown Washington, D.C. It's good you caught me this week because I'm about to go to 5 different places over the next 5.5 weeks, but I'm here now at home, if you will.
That's awesome. I'll look forward to hearing what those places are. You are the World Bank's Senior Education and Technology Policy Specialist and Global Lead for Innovation in Education, which is a hell of a title.
It's 2 lines on my business card.
I know. Tell us, what the heck does that mean? I mean, this is, you've got the EduTech blog out there that you do. You've got a bunch of different things that you participate in, and you've been doing this for quite a while. Why don't you tell us what that means professionally for you today?
Sure. So to the joke here at the World Bank, and I think most of the Terms of Reference podcast listeners probably know the World Bank, but we are a multilateral development institution. We are part of the United Nations family of institutions, and we are actually a bank, and we actually loan money to countries who then use those monies to do all sorts of development types of things. You know, traditionally it was a lot about building infrastructure, and increasingly it's about the more human side or softer side of development, including things in education, which is where I work, which initially was about building lots of schools, and increasingly it's about all sorts of things in addition to building schools, what happens inside schools and outside of schools as well with learning. The joke here is that sort of when you plug something in the education sector, I may get a call. So I work on things, or I provide support for people who are exploring, how we can use technology in interesting and useful ways to support whatever it is someone wants to do, a country, an education system, a teacher wants to do in education.
So give us a couple practical examples. You're about to go on, you said to 5 different places. Is this going to be 5 conferences, or are these practical examples of you helping people to quote unquote plug things in and move the ball forward in some technology, or?
Yeah, so a bit of both. So I'll be in Kenya starting next week, and as you may know, or certainly many of your listeners may know, Kenya's made some promises about getting laptops out to lots and lots of primary school students. And then the question is, what are they going to do with these things? How do they do that sort of thing?
I was just going to say, I'm not embarrassingly, but I just, I'm not familiar with that. Why don't you break that down a little bit for it, and what's the goal behind that?
Sure. And thinking about that, one of the ideas is that there are lots of places, there are lots, especially in rural areas, where there are poorly resourced schools, and there are teachers who may not be all that experienced. And around the world, we see that there is a great challenge in recruiting and retaining teachers, especially in rural areas and some of the most challenging environments. And then the question is, how do we support teachers in those types of places? A couple of years ago, right next door to Kenya, the Minister of Education from Tanzania told me that they had a shortage of 43,000 teachers. That means they had teaching places for 43,000 teachers who just weren't there. And things have improved quite a bit since then. But the question is, if your teacher training colleges, let's say, graduate 1,000 teachers a year, how are you ever going to make up a 43,000 teacher deficit? You're probably not under business as usual. And so people turn to business unusual, if you will. And lots of time that involves technology in some way. So how can you support perhaps less qualified, younger, less experienced teachers at a distance? There are lots of hypotheses about how to do that. There's some good examples as well. But you think it makes sense that technology might have some role to play.
So give us an example of you said you're going to go work on this laptop issue in Kenya. Is there something you can point to maybe over the last year or 2 years where you said, hey, here's an online distance education program we help support? Or can you give us a real specific, tangible example of a program you've been supporting or either stood up in the recent history?
Yeah, and so the coolest, and by way of answering that, I'll say that, a lot is happening sort of at the ground level, bubbling up. And I think one of the challenges of working in a place like the World Bank, a big sort of stodgy conservative institution like the World Bank, is to figure out where cool stuff is going on, where innovative people are doing innovative things, and giving them some support and figuring out how to take what they're doing and support them and do it at a larger scale. This idea of supporting teachers at a distance. In Papua New Guinea, where I was there, last year. So Papua New Guinea, they have some real challenges. For those who don't know it, it's a country right near Australia in the Pacific, and it's characterized by lots and lots of remote schools. So you might have teachers who, for example, to get their pay stub, they may have to travel for a week and a half to get their salary and come back a week later. So they're out of school for 2 weeks. That's how remote a lot of these schools are. And they did someone did an interesting study where they looked at what teachers were actually teaching in some of these classrooms. And they found that on a given day in a given week that about 5% of teachers were teaching what was meant to be in the curriculum on that day. And so you think that's obviously not a good thing. And so somebody noticed that, a lot of these teachers have mobile phones. And they said, I wonder if there's some way we could connect with them, at least to share with them. Maybe they don't know actually what's in the curriculum because the textbooks haven't arrived, or maybe never arrived, or maybe they haven't received training about what they're meant to be teaching or how they're supposed to teach, and they're just not comfortable with it. So they set up a scheme, if you will, where teachers on Monday just got a text message sort of saying from the Ministry of Education, we're so happy that you're helping these students, and we're so excited that you're going to be teaching, topic A this week. And which would alert teachers a couple things. One, that someone cared about what they were doing and was paying attention to them and even knew their name. And second, that gave them a sense of what they were supposed to be teaching that week in the curriculum. And then it would follow up with just a short sort of teaching tip or hint to give them some additional information, maybe as a reminder to what they're supposed to be teaching. And so this is really basic, simple stuff. Yeah, you think this isn't earth-shattering, and it isn't, I guess. But they found after a few months of doing this that in the classrooms where this was happening, there were about 22% of the teachers were teaching what was in the curriculum. And these are, I can't remember these. And so you think by some measures, that's a big failure. 1 in 5 teachers are teaching what they're meant to be teaching that week. If that's important to you, it may or may not be. But that's a 7-fold increase.
Sure,
what had happened before.
Was there any thought that when those text messages started coming, because they weren't necessarily expected, that this is Big Brother talking to you? Like, is there that aspect to it?
I don't think so there. And so my figures may not be exact. The Terms of Reference podcast listeners may want to Google the name Amanda Watson, who's done a lot of really good research in this area. Her papers will have more specific information about a lot of this, but I don't think so. So that's an interesting thing as well about some of our cultural constructs that we carry from one place to another about how people view certain things and how people view the use of technology. I think that's something I'm very aware of. I try to be aware of myself, but I'm always regularly amazed at just the different ways people consider the use of technology and, what it's intended to do or what some engineer dreamed up in Helsinki or Silicon Valley or Cambridge and how that technology is actually put to use in some other part of the world. They may be at odds oftentimes. And I'm constantly amazed at sort of the ingenuity that people have in finding inventive uses for tech developed in one place for another purpose that has then been, for better or for worse, exported to some other place.
I want to explore for a minute a sentence that you said, just sort of to kick off your explanation in a few seconds. You said, the World Bank, most people know it as this sort of stodgy, bureaucratic, place, for lack of a better term. you are tasked with, you are empowered to spark innovation, foster innovation, which is many times by definition, fast, agile, thinking differently. Over your career, over the last 20 years at the World Bank, how has that played out? How do you navigate the stodgy, sort of bureaucratic system with needing to be an innovator?
Yeah, so that's a fundamental question or challenge I wrestle with pretty much every day. And, can you make change, or can you help make change, or can you function inside a big bureaucratic institution and provide space for other people to make change and do useful and interesting things? That's I think, a regular challenge for me. We've been undergoing lots of restructuring in the last couple of years at the World Bank. It's, I guess, the nature of all of our businesses today. And we've had something called an innovation lab hosted here in one part of the World Bank, which was set up sort of as a special place where innovations, new things could be tried out. And then the question is, because people had a little bit of space to think and try out new things. And so things like the World Bank's work with big data or geospatial data, or introduction of design thinking principles in project design, a lot of that, those types of innovations have come into the World Bank through this innovations lab. And that was recently shut down a couple of months ago. And
really, that's
some people,
I didn't know that. That's
and I think
recent.
So. Yeah, and so I think it points to one of the challenges of how you take where you have a special place for innovation and how you then transfer that into the mainstream of what you do. And I think that's a real challenge, because it can be seen as a special place where, the crazy people are doing crazy things, and we kind of set off a special place on the side. So, people said, what does that mean for the bank? I think it's just the way of the world. Even if that place is no longer inside the institution, and no doubt we'll have something similar pop up in subsequent years as well. I have no doubt about that. But the people who were there, they haven't disappeared. Those people have moved on to other places, other things. Some have moved on outside the bank, and they have an understanding of how the World Bank works and doesn't work. And they're going to do very innovative things, some of which they'll do working with the World Bank. Other people have moved to other parts of our institution. And with all this experience and knowledge, I think, and we're going to see, at a personal level, lots of interesting things happen. This sort of mirrors what had happened. One of the first jobs I had here, and what's really attracted me to the institution, worked on a program called WorldLinks, which introduced technology and education systems in 22 middle and low income countries for the first time in support of teacher training. And for its time, this is the late 1990s, it was real frontier stuff. And we worked with lots of real, let's say, frontier people, innovative people around the world. And that program ran its course as well. And it was inside the World Bank. Then it was spun out as a separate NGO, and the NGO no longer exists. And some people say, isn't it sad that that structure no longer exists? But I see people, and I hear about people who are associated with that all over the world doing really cool things. So I think the struggle of, how you cite, where you cite innovation inside an institution, and do you give it, what's the shelf life of it? I think it's a challenge that we struggle with here, and I think everyone does.
Well, it's also something that we've talked about here on the show, but it's also something that I think everyone who's in the development or humanitarian aid business can admit to themselves, that we're not really good at letting structures go away when their time has run their course, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't know if that's the case for the WebLinks one that you just said, but who knows? I don't know the exact story there, but especially when we're talking about new ideas, new innovations, new things, there's going to come a time where, hey, we're going to choose a path, and that means that the other path can't be chosen, and so there you go. We have to. Some of those things will go away, and we're going to walk down this path for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe, there are all sorts of, there's certainly big institutions have no monopoly on innovation. In fact, big institutions may be seen as inhibitors of innovation in lots of places. So I think the fact that inside organizations like ours, there's this ebb and flow and change, I think it's only natural. But it's really the people, I think, because it's as much, for me, innovation, I'm not exactly sure what it means. It's something that's positive, new change, I guess. But it's a mindset as much as anything. Mm-hmm. And the fact that where you can find people doing innovative things, whether in big institutions or small ones, that's where I'm excited. Those are the things I'm excited by, more so than the particular name on that person's business card.
Sure. I think that that's one of the things that we're investigating over these podcasts that we're doing that are focused on the innovation space in development and aid. Is that I think the jury's out whether or not we innovate better in small groups or as individuals or in big institutions. I think the jury's very much out on that, specifically because you have these pockets and it's individual driven, and you have people who are innovating out of necessity, whereas other people are innovating because they've actually received investment to do so. So, there's so many different angles to it.
Yeah, I think so. And there's a couple different types of, I would say two major types of innovation as I see it, Stephen. One is doing what you're doing more cheaply or better or faster or more broadly. So that's legitimate, absolutely. And there's another type of innovation, which is doing what you couldn't do before.
Right, solving the problem in a different way. Yeah.
In a different way. And both those are innovation, types of innovations, I think. And maybe certain groups are better at trying to slice off different pieces of those two types of innovation models, I guess.
One final question on this thread is, have you seen, because you've been at the bank for so many years, have you seen specific ways in which the bank has changed its structure, its governance, its leadership, its reporting, just the way that it functions to adapt to these new realities? Or is it not one thing that you can point your finger at?
There's always change. There's always change here. It may not seem it from the outside, or the change that's reported on the outside, maybe a lot of superficial things. But as far as, processes and procedures and the influx of new people, there are certainly lots of changes. Right now, there are a couple units that are specifically tasked with exploring new processes, new ways of doing different parts of our project cycle. For example, it's all boring bureaucratic stuff, but there are conscious efforts to give people a little more rope to explore new ways of doing things, in the hope that then the rest of the institution can benefit from it. But really, it's a lot of little stuff, in addition to the broader, grander pronouncements and sort of structural changes that happen from on high.
Well, but it's all the unsexy things that ultimately add up to making the one big breakthrough, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they, whatever they said, Deng Xiaoping, said that you walk across the stream by feeling the pebbles. And so, that sort of feeling the pebbles and just making this little step change here and there, in the end, it can add up to something quite big and profound sometimes. That's not to say we shouldn't be thinking about whole other ways of engineering a way to get across the river, of course.
Before I dive into sort of the disruptions that you've seen, the thing that strikes me about your title and the work that you've described is, it seems like you, help me understand, do you have a team that you work with? Do you have a group of people that you work with? Or, because it would seem to me it'd be a very daunting task to be one individual, who's responsible for, moving forward innovation in the education space for the entire World Bank on its global portfolio.
Yeah, so my soccer coach, growing up would always say there's no I in team, but there is in my case, because I'm meant to literally float between teams and across teams here. There are lots of people doing innovative, interesting stuff embedded in our various operations, and my job is to help them by introducing them to interesting people and organizations and ideas and models, to help them sort of expose them to other things that are happening as a way to maybe accelerate some of the types of things they're doing. Again, it's this issue of, do you try to have a special dedicated team of people or group and they're seen as the ones doing new stuff? Or do you try to enable the mainstream of people and the mainstream of activities to do innovative things? And my job is to help accelerate innovations where they're happening inside the World Bank and outside, by sort of identifying them and where I can bring them a little bit more exposure or make connections that are useful, whether it's tapping funds, whether it's just helping with partnerships. That's sort of part of my role here.
So you have what would be, I imagine, anybody who's listening to this, a massively enviable job. I mean, you're an accelerator, you're a connector, you're a catalyst, you're a network, right? I mean, this is fundamental parts of your job description. Does your ability to do this come from the fact that you've been at the bank for a long time and you just have that deep institutional knowledge of what's going on where? Do you have a system that you use that's really purposeful about how you're just sort of bringing in this feed of information that you can sort through? Or how do you connect the dots?
I certainly don't have any process, really, Stephen. I mean, I think I'm fundamentally just super curious. And I'm interested in what people are doing and what people's challenges are, and to see where I can help share information about other people that are having similar challenges or ask similar questions. And I just talk with lots and lots and lots of people. And, I think no question is dumb, I guess. That said, I'm happy to ask lots of people lots of dumb questions, or just to go out and investigate what's happening. and see where there might be a connection. That means that the job is a bit unstructured, and it's, I'm sure as far as personal sort of career development, that's not the greatest thing because there aren't clear metrics for success, although of course there are always metrics for failure. But I think what drives me is I'm just really curious about, and it's such an interesting time to be doing this kind of work. And there's so many interesting people doing interesting things that are sort of below the radar of institutions like mine, and just being able to, and it's personally satisfying to be able to find some of those folks and to help them either get someone off their back or with just a little bit of support in useful ways.
So over the last, let's just say 3 years, all of these cool things, like you say, lots of institutions, there are lots of small groups of people doing some really cool stuff. We've had a lot of them on the show here, right?
Yeah, you have.
What do you think are the biggest disruptions that you've seen, or fundamental, game changers that you've seen that you're really either excited to bring into the ed space or entering the ed space right now, or you think are going to make a difference?
Yeah, in education. So, and lots of folks I talk with, they seem to equate innovation with technology, and there's obviously a link between those two things. Just because you add tech to something doesn't make it de facto innovative. At least in my view, some people may label it as such.
It's something I was going to ask you whether or not I'd love to explore that, whether or not you look at innovations outside tech as well. But let's save that for next question.
Yeah, so on the tech side, but that said, just the proliferation of cheap computing devices, obviously low-cost phones, increasingly smartphones, and tablets. This is certainly a theme that's been on many of the Terms of Reference podcasts, but has just been and has the potential to be a great game changer in all sorts of ways. Education systems itself, they don't change. They don't change quickly. You look, there's the old canard about, looking at an operating theater from 100 years ago and today, and doctors wouldn't recognize, doctors from the 19th century, 20th century wouldn't recognize what an operating theater looks like today, but teachers would feel totally at home. That is, to some extent true, I guess, although
I've never heard that one before, and that is scary.
Yeah, but that said, there's also a famous saying named Mark Prensky is the guy who coined it, saying innovation is happening everywhere but in the classroom. But there's a lot of innovation happening with learning, and it's happening in society. And because these tools are there's connectivity increasingly, there are gadgets, and it is pressing and putting pressure on education officials and teachers and schools to change things because it's coming in from the outside and they're having to adapt to it. And we're seeing with all sorts of ways, I guess, that's happening. One of the things that gets a lot of play, certainly here in the States, is the Khan Academy, which is this initially a series of free videos on YouTube that are small tutorials about, the Pythagorean theorem or basic algebra concepts. And putting those online, we've seen that for students who are sort of self-starters and are good learners and already highly motivated, that can be a tool that they use to really help their learning and to move them forward. And we've seen those types of sort of self-tutorial things be repackaged and made available offline and via mobile phones in some of the projects that we've worked on around the world. That's interesting, I think. It points to a fundamental challenge of a lot of these new innovations that they tend to help those who already have various advantages already, because those people are able to take advantage of them more quickly for a variety of reasons. And I think that's while looking to introducing innovation, I think this is a challenge we face here, and I think everyone faces, to think about, the rising tide may raise all boats, but it doesn't raise them equally, and certainly doesn't raise them at the same speed.
So you've got, you mentioned that it's definitely the shrinking cost of mobile devices, the shrinking cost of mobile technologies and tablets, mobile phones is definitely a game changer. Are there any specific processes, tools, even whole systems? Is there an education system out there in the world that you've visited where you said, wow, these guys are just doing it completely differently?
I don't know that a system is doing it completely differently, but there are systems that are thinking about doing things differently. And one example that lots of people like to put up as an example of innovation is the Singaporean education system. I think that it's such a hothouse flower environment in many ways. I don't think that while it points to the way things can possibly be done, it's a highly developed, rich country, very small, has a lot of very unique characteristics. Mm-hmm. But when they started to introduce technology and they saw that there were disruptions that happened as a result of it, they reduced the size of their curriculum by about 10% to give teachers the ability or the space to innovate. And I thought that sort of approach to thinking about how can we introduce innovation, how can we give teachers space to do something new? Because typically when technology is introduced, for example, in schools, it's an additional, in some cases, burden. It's something that teachers have to do in addition to what they're already doing because their work processes aren't, for lack of a better term, re-engineered, to use a horrible term from the 90s. And so a way of backing off and giving people space. In Uruguay, which is the first country in the world where all students received a free laptop, all public school students, and all schools were connected to the internet, or technically the second country, Niue in the Pacific was the first country where every school was connected, but there are only 2 schools in that small Pacific island nation. They said, we are a small country sitting between, and they're relatively well off, but certainly in South America, we're sitting between 2 regional economic giants, Argentina and Brazil. What can we do? How can we change, and how can we equip our kids to be able to compete not only for jobs here in Uruguay and not only against our neighbors to the north and south or east and west, but around the world? And they've said that we need to change things and mix things up. And if we introduce lots of technology, it will force us to change. The Minister of Education at the time when they started this project said, we are taking a risk and we are jumping off a big cliff here. And by doing that, we're going to force ourselves to figure out how to land safely. It takes a real visionary set of leaders, and it takes a lot of support from the population to have that sort of approach to change, I think. But out of that, we've seen lots of interesting things happen. And many of the most interesting things, I think, are things that they hadn't thought about. And for example,
what? I was going to say, what's something that they haven't thought about?
I've been talking in generalities, all the time. So let's talk about some specific stuff that's pretty cool. So in Uruguay, they have a challenge of teaching English. They think English language instruction, being able to speak English, will be an important thing that kids and young people will need if they are to compete in an increasingly globalized workforce. But they don't have enough teachers of English there in Uruguay. But they have schools that are connected to the internet. Everybody has a device, a laptop, in some cases now they're tablets. And so what they've done is they've worked with the British Council, and they have English teachers in the capital, Montevideo. They have English teachers in Buenos Aires in Argentina. They have English teachers in the Philippines who are coming in virtually by something like Skype to classrooms and co-teaching English language instruction courses in elementary schools in Uruguay.
Right. They just grown their teacher pool, globally, in this particular subject, right?
Yeah, and it's something they had never thought that this would be something that they would do. It wasn't part of the plan initially, but some bright people said, "Hey, we've got all this connectivity, and it connects us to other parts of the world. Can we draw on resources in other parts of the world?" And what happens there is you have it's not taught by a teacher in the Philippines. It's co-taught. There's a teacher, an English teacher in Uruguay, who maybe doesn't speak English all that well or isn't all that confident, or maybe hasn't received a lot of training in English language instruction. And there's an English language teacher in the Philippines who comes in and they conduct a class together in a structured way. And then that teacher in Uruguay then has a follow-up lesson later in the week that she leads alone. And then they come back with the teacher who comes in remotely. And this is something that, could only be made possible by the use of technology. And it's pretty interesting.
What are the pieces that needed to be in place in Uruguay, if I can keep going down the road on this particular example, for them to take the risk of putting their schools online, giving every kid a laptop, reaching out to a global forum for English teaching? Was it the fact that they had enough financial resources? Were they in a place that was just like, look, we are backed up against a wall because of Argentina and Brazil, that we need to do this? Was it just political will? Was it a combination of all those? Where I'm going is like innovation. It's hard to find someone who says, oh yeah, I'd love to be a part of that, but it's just too risky. We can't take the risk to do that. What's the recipe for being able to jump off?
I think it's a combination of all those factors, Stephen, and more. The fact that from on high, the president himself was willing to articulate the vision to do this sort of thing. And it was pretty bipartisan. The idea there was the fact that all this tech went into schools wasn't so much about learning per se initially, but it was a way to get all this technology into the hands or into the homes of Uruguayans. Because if you have a kid with the technology and the connectivity in a house,
sure, they bring it home, they
bring it home. Everybody has it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it was a way. Education sector was the vector for introducing this tool into society. And when the government changed there, It was interesting. There was no change at all in the program. This is one of the things that people really bought into. And I think they bought into it for a number of reasons. One of which is that it was billed, and Uruguayans have a real strong sense of equality and equality of opportunity. And the way they rolled out the program there, I think, is instructive. And it's interesting because pretty much nowhere else in the world has done it this way. They introduced this stuff in the program into the most remote and the less advantaged places first. And it wasn't until the very end of the rollout that you had this stuff appear in, the upper middle class suburbs of Montevideo, the capital. And that got a lot of people behind it. It meant that the model that they rolled out was one that had to work in these harder to operate in places. Most times when we see innovations, or a lot of times when we see it, certainly top-down innovation, it goes to where it can work the easiest first.
I.e. Silicon Valley.
Yeah, because we want to see it work there, right? And we need to make sure we get the model right before we expand it out to other places. And, a lot of places have found challenges in doing that, taking a model that works in a highly advantaged place with all sorts of special characteristics and then broadening that to other places that aren't like that, that can be very difficult. But if you have a model that works in some of the tougher environments, and if you, in the words of the Uruguayans, you start down and out and then move up and in, it's a way to have a model that works more broadly, and it's a way to have a model that works for larger numbers of people, and there are important, I think, implications for equity.
Where have you seen innovation fail? The deeper question that I like to ask is, what are the bigger challenges, or what are the roadblocks to implementing these kinds of innovations in the education sector? That's the bigger question, but do you have a specific example where something like Uruguay tried to happen in the world, but just either ran out of steam or it just fell flat?
Yeah, well, there's certainly. So you mentioned this EduTech blog that I write on the World Bank website and have for a lot of years now. The most popular post I've done by far has had over 1 million reads altogether. It's called Worst Practice in ICT use in education. And I think the fact that it's the most read, I think, speaks to the fact that there is a lot of failure in this area. And there's a lot of, there are two types of failure. There's good failure and there's dumb failure. There's also a lot of dumb failure. And the dumb failure we see over and over again is just, dumping technology into schools, for example, and hoping magic to happen, not having a plan, thinking that things will happen automatically because kids are quote unquote digital natives, term that's fraught with all sorts of obscures as much as it illuminates in lots of cases, and thinking that, just because the technology is there, your problem is solved. The other thing, I think another classic mistake that we see made over and over again is this belief, and I hear this unfortunately from ministers of education in many places. They say, we have problems with our teachers, we have problems with our teacher union. If only technology could replace teachers, I'd get rid of these problems and I'd be able to manage it. And in nowhere in the world do we see technology replacing teachers. Nowhere. In fact, it changes some of what teachers do. It changes some of their responsibilities, but in nowhere do we see it replacing teachers. Instead, what we see is it makes their role more central. It makes it more difficult in some ways and easier in others. It changes their role, but it certainly doesn't replace them. And where we see that there is, political rhetoric, maybe because it's one party and the teachers' unions are associated with another party, that, we're going to use this to replace teachers. That's not a way, I think, to introduce an innovation that's going to take hold in schools, for example, because you've alienated one of your key constituents. In fact,
I was just going to say, you've alienated the very people that you're going to depend upon to deliver it. So why in the world would they support it?
Absolutely. And that's a challenge. That's a problem that unfortunately we still see, over 20 years that I've been doing this stuff, we see happen over and over again. This sort of rhetoric, this anti-teacher rhetoric, and this belief that the technology itself is the solution.
That's admittedly a new one to me. What about in the education space as well? Is there a barrier in that parents are, there's a fear factor there, parents, because the parents aren't, especially in the technology field, right? They're not savvy, and so, gosh, if my children are empowered in a way that I can't control or at least participate, then why would I support it? Do you see that?
So in my experience, that sort of sentiment from parents, so broadly speaking, is more of a sort of an OECD or developed country phenomenon, where there's this fear. There is in much of the world, perhaps because technology is a new thing, or it's a new thing in the lives of many folks. There is an excitement about it, and there's a belief in its ability to offer new opportunities to students, for example, that perhaps has been maybe tempered by experience in the United States, for example, or in Europe. There are other factors at play as well, but it's a different conversation in different places. It's a very different conversation in different places, I think. And we see in many cases that it's parents in the places where I work, it's parents who are pushing for this stuff to be introduced in schools. They're not exactly sure how it will work, but it's also an important symbol, I think, of belief in the possibility of positive change. And it's maybe an example of a sort of fundamental optimism that I guess education is meant to be it is a fundamentally optimistic exercise. Yeah, we're making investments in our kids so that they become happy adults, productive members of society, good citizens, and that won't happen for 10, 15 years down the road. So we have to be optimistic about these. And technology for many people is a symbol of that sort of optimism.
I think it's a very, at least in my mind, I mean, I've never really considered, the developed world, the European, the Americas, how that would juxtapose against the developed world as a parental reaction. That's something to marinate on for sure. Is there anything that you've seen over the last 20 years that is just sort of, it was an innovation in the 90s, but now it's like it's a no-brainer, everybody does it, that's happening now?
I mean, I guess connectivity itself.
I guess what I'm asking is, are there pieces that have become standard ops, right? Like that would be the thing that we're always looking for in the development world or the aid world, where rather than piloting projects or, hey, let's try these new things out, it's like that it's just a no-brainer. It's just there now.
I don't have an easy answer to that question when it comes to technology and education. People would say, I mean, computers are a no-brainer, or tech in some way in schools is a no-brainer, but that's neither here nor there because it's what you do with it. Of course, it's, if technology is the answer, what's the question? So where it's assumed that this is the answer, the question I think is different in different places, and it should be about what these tools are meant to be used for, or what challenges they're meant to quote unquote solve. I don't know that we really solve anything, but we certainly help things in all sorts of ways. I don't know if that's a good answer or the type of thing you're looking for, but I think the fundamental optimism and interest in technology use in education, for better and for worse, is more solidly embedded in education systems now than it was 20 years ago, for sure. And even if we don't necessarily know how to use it well, that sense of belief that it should be there or its inevitability, I think, is pretty much a foregone conclusion.
Ultimately, there's no right answer there. It's just I'm always interested to see if there is one particular lever, in the logistics model or in the communication model or whatever, in whatever particular piece of the sector we're talking about. But in this case, it's the ecosystem of education, what has been absorbed over the last 20 years. And of course, technology is there, mobile phones are there, connectivity is there. And now it'll be interesting over the next 20 years to see which of the apps continue to bubble up, or more importantly, the fundamentals of those apps that we then just sort of take for granted, like email. There's a million different email clients, but everybody assumes you have to have an email, of course. That everybody does. There's lots of different flavors, but you have to be able to communicate that way.
Yeah, and it's interesting, even that and sort of our assumptions, like you think email is just absolutely embedded, but if you look at kids around the world, they're not using email, and there's an international
I knew you were going to strike me down as soon as I use that example.
And sorry, that may be easy
pickings. No,
but,
it's true. My kids don't use email, they use messengers, right?
Yeah, and so there's now an international comparative study that happens every couple of years looking at kids' sort of information and computer literacy. It's called ICILS. One of the things that they test for, that they assess, is students' ability to use email, to receive email, to decode, what the subject means, what's happened with a chain of emails, and different kids in different countries do better and worse than other ones, obviously. But, in Thailand, for example, kids did much worse on email, this email literacy, than many people perhaps expected, given the level of development there and the technology penetration there. And, I looked at it and I asked the question I don't see lots of kids and students using email there. They use different things. They use chat, they use Facebook, and they use Instagram. So their method of communication, this is one of the challenges when you're trying to assess someone's ability to use a certain tool. We've moved on from that tool. So I think that's one of the fundamentals, this digital native hypothesis, I call it, this idea that young people somehow innately, automatically know how to use technology. That is, I think, still, while lots of academics have put all sorts of holes in that hypothesis over the years, I find it still has a real salience, and it's a real driving factor behind many decisions at the top level of ministries of education around the world, that kids just automatically know how to use this stuff. I might argue that there's a big difference between knowing how to manipulate menus on a screen versus, to use it productively to learn.
But isn't the subtext there as well, though? It's not that they don't know how to use technology or do not know how to use, but how they will approach using it is likely very different than the Minister of Education, right?
Even if you believe this digital native hypothesis, even if you believe that we have such things called digital natives, those people will be digital immigrants, to use in the term that Mark Prensky uses, in the future, because the tech changes. What we do, people say, oh, they automatically know how to use, or they understand these tools. The tools are going to change. And I remember in the early days of, for example, like the One Laptop Per Child initiative, where there were some of the proponents of that who were just not that optimistic about the use of mobile phones, because they were innovators who grew up with the laptop model and mindset, and just didn't see the fact that they didn't appreciate the extent to which other people would adopt phones as their first technology tool, and that their sort of worldview of use of technology would be defined more by that form factor than the one that had defined theirs. So I think that's a long way to perhaps around or to avoid your question.
Well, as always on these conversations, there's never enough time. Any one of these topics we could dive deeper, but I always wrap up each of a conversation with two questions here. And the first one that I would like to ask you is, you run the EduTech blog. You've been doing it for a long time. As you said, it's been widely read. But who do you pay attention to stay informed? Obviously, your network within the World Bank, but are there particular blogs, podcasts, other information sources that you think other people should be aware of?
Sure, yeah, and I look to a couple of places. So, one place that I look, like if you want to see what the future of technology use in education is going to look like, just like with technology use in society, looking to China. What's going on in China, even we see now with the way like the new evolution of iOS has happened, it's taken a lot from the experience with WeChat in China and a lot of the way people are using technology in innovative ways there. So I think if you want to see the future of a lot of things that we're going to have in other parts of the world, look to China. That's where a lot of innovation is happening. Inside sort of the development community, the stuff that the UNICEF Innovations Unit touches, oftentimes they are out in front of what's going on. And I think if you're interested in what's happening in really cool ways, I don't want to promote stuff we're doing at the World Bank, so the UNICEF Innovations Unit is a place to look. There is a meeting that takes place in October of every year called the Mobile M-Education Alliance, and it brings together all sorts of innovative people around the world. If people look at meducationalliance.org on the internet, you'll see lots of interesting small projects around the world using technology in innovative ways and lots of innovative people. And I think looking up, Googling those people and their organizations, many of them are small NGOs, that's a real cool place to look. And also to look at the X Prize. There's an X Prize for global learning. There's this a prize out there. It's a $15 million prize altogether to promote the development of tools that can be used to help learners in remote areas of the world develop literacy skills. And the interesting thing about this prize, in addition to the prizing sort of mechanism, which we can, is this a good thing to do? And there's a criticism that this is sort of technocentric approach to development, and all those things might be true. But it's focusing attention on the needs of users that people who develop technology usually don't think about. People in rural areas who have certain learning needs. And I think out of that competition, and I met with lots of folks, we hosted a meeting of companies and NGOs and just hackers here at the World Bank a couple months ago who are competing for that. Out of that, we just are going to see lots of interesting approaches to the use of technology. I think out of that process, we are going to see some interesting things happen. I don't know if anyone will win the prize in the end, but I think looking at initiatives like that try to put the focus on needs of users whose needs usually aren't taken into consideration, I think those are interesting places to look.
Final question is, what is, or is there one thing, this is an opportunity to super geek out, even though I know you do that all day, every day. Anything outside the education world, education technology world that you think is super cool, super exciting, some innovation for humanitarian aid, international development that you just would love other people to know about?
Well, I think everybody knows of. Autonomous vehicles obviously is it's the thing that everyone's geeking out about now, really excited about, and all that is all the different technologies are embedded to make that sort of thing happen, including the fact that, all the sensor technology. And, we used to, the phone, the sort of people in the know, quote unquote, have talked about this phone is really a small computer that we have in our pocket. But increasingly, I think we're recognizing that this is actually a small sensor device. And what we call a camera today is actually a really sophisticated optical sensor. And what we're seeing with the ability to, because of computing power and the decreasing cost, Moore's Law and all sorts of things, we're able to process visual information, non-text information, and do interesting things with it. And I think that that's an area, augmented reality is one result of some of that we're going to see just lots of really cool stuff happen. And that's obviously related in some small part to what's happening with autonomous vehicles, is their ability to navigate using sensors and all sorts of GPS, all sorts of things. But I think those are two areas that I'm really interested about. What are their applications in the education space? I could hypothesize about lots of them, but no doubt I'll be wrong. And it'll be interesting to see what they are going forward.
No doubt I'll be wrong. On that note, thank you so much for being a guest on the show today. This has been a fascinating conversation. We'll encourage everybody to check out the EduTech blog and follow you into the future.
Great. Thanks so much, Stephen. It's been great talking with you.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.